Good morning. This is Rajeshkumar. Today we are going to analyze one problem question on constructive manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter in criminal law. Disclaimer: the video content has been made available for informational and educational purpose only. Kindly go through the slide completely. Let's start with the problem question. Thomas and Cammy have been the best friends since childhood and consider themselves brothers. They both smoke marijuana and sometimes take cocaine. Cammy tells Thomas that he has some heroin for them to try. They go to Cormy's flat where Cormy prepares a syringe and hand it to Thomas, who injects himself. Unfortunately, the dose of heroin proves far too strong for Thomas, and Thomas loses consciousness. Cormy panics and tries to rouse Thomas. Cormy starts searching for advice online and phones their friends for suggestions. Eventually, an hour later, he calls for an ambulance. The junior doctor at the hospital mixes up Thomas' notes with those of another patient and thinks that Thomas has had a stroke and treats him accordingly. Soon after, Thomas dies from the untreated drug overdose. Corby hears a consultant tell the junior doctor that if he had treated Thomas with correct medication, there is an 80% chance that Thomas would have survived. Corby is shocked at the treatment provided by the junior doctor and starts shouting at him. He became increasingly aggressive and pushes the doctor, who falls on the ground. As he falls, the doctor suffers a heart attack and dies. It later transpires that the doctor suffered from a heart condition of which he was not previously aware. We have to discuss the liability of Cormy for the death of Thomas and the junior doctor. Cormy's action could potentially satisfy the elements of constructive manslaughter, which requires an unlawful act. That act to be dangerous, causation, and the resulting death. The unlawful act in this case is Cormy's supply of heroin to Thomas, which is criminal under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. However, under R versus Kennedy number 2 in 2007, the voluntary injection of drugs by Thomas constitute a free, voluntary, and informed act, breaking the chain of causation between Cormy's supply of heroin and Thomas' death. Consequently, the constructive manslaughter cannot be established. This reasoning aligns with R versus Law, where a failure to act as opposed to an unlawful act cannot support a constructive manslaughter. And R versus the Field and Rebello case, which reinforced the principle that a victim's informed and voluntary actions absolve the supplier of liability in drug related death. In other words, a Cormy's liability for Thomas' death can be considered under both the constructive manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter. A constructive manslaughter requires an unlawful act that is dangerous and causes death, while Cormy supplied heroin, which is unlawful under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. The voluntary act of Thomas injecting himself breaks the chain of causation. The House of Lords in R versus Kennedy clarified that a voluntary and informed acts by the victim absolve the supplier of liability in such cases. Similarly, in R versus Law case, an omission or the failure to act cannot support a charge of constructive manslaughter, further limiting the liability. Thus, a constructive manslaughter is not applicable. The Karmi's action are more appropriately analyzed under gross negligence manslaughter. According to the test in R versus Adamco in 1995, the prosecution must establish a duty of care, a breach of that duty, an obvious risk of death, a gross negligence, and causation. A duty of care arises when someone creates or contributes to the life threatening situation as held in all versus events in 2009. By providing heroin to Thomas, Cormick created a dangerous situation and was responsible for ensuring his safety. Cormick breached this duty by delaying the medical assistant for over an hour. Similarly to the breach seen in R versus Broughton, where the failure to summon timely help constituted a serious breach of duty. There was an obvious and significant risk of death due to the heroin and known dangers. Satisfying the test in R versus Rose in 2017. A communist's gross negligence is demonstrated by his delay in calling an ambulance, significantly increasing the likelihood of Thomas' death, while a junior doctor's negligence in treating Thomas introduces a complicating factor. The chain of causation is likely unbroken. In R versus Cheshire, it was held that the medical errors do not break the chain of causation unless they are so overwhelming as to render the original act insignificant. Here, the communist actions remained a substantial and operative cause of Thomas' death. Therefore, Cormy is likely liable for gross negligence manslaughter in relation to Thomas. Further, a Cormy's liability for junior doctor's death can be considered under the constructive manslaughter. The push delivered by Cormy constituted a common assault, fulfilling the requirement of an unlawful act as per R versus Franklin in 1883. Under R versus Church in 1966, the unlawful act must also be objectively dangerous, meaning it carries the risk of some harm to the victim. While a commie was unaware of the doctor's pre existing heart conditions. The act of showing someone is inherently dangerous as it carries a foreseeable risk of physical injury. This distinguishes the case from R versus Dawson in 1985, where the victim's vulnerability was unforeseeable and aligns it more closely with R versus Watson in 1989, where the victim's fragility increased the danger posed by the unlawful act. Hence, the causation is also satisfied as Comey's push was a substantial and operative cause of the doctor's heart attack and subsequent death. In R versus Cheshire, the court emphasized that a pre existing condition does not break the chain of causation. unless it's entirely independent of the different action. The doctor's heart condition, though unknown to Kami, was triggered by the fall caused by the push, making the Kami's act of significant cause of death. Consequently, the Kami is likely liable for constructive manslaughter in relation to the junior's doctor's death. So the Comey's liability of Thomas Tate is the best established under the gross negligence manslaughter due to his creation of a dangerous situation, his delayed response, and the unbroken chain of causation despite the medical negligence involved. For the junior doctor's death, the Comey's aggressive push constitutes an unlawful and dangerous act that directly caused the fatal heart attack, satisfying the requirements for constructive manslaughter. In other words, a duty of care. In all versus events, the court held that a duty of care arises when a person contributes to the life-threatening situation by supplying and encouraging Thomas to use heroin, a comic created the dangerous situation, establishing a duty of care. Under the breach of duty, a commun's delay in calling for an ambulance for over an hour constitutes a serious breach of this duty. In R versus Bronson, a failing to summon the medical assistance in similar circumstances was held to be a breach. The obvious risk of death for the gross negligence manslaughter, the risk must be objectively obvious in R versus Rose in 2017 and R versus Misra in 2004 emphasized that the risk of the death must be clear and significant. Here, the Corby's action involved an evident risk of death due to the unknown dangers of heroin overdose. The gross negligence, a breach of duty, must be so severe as to warrant the criminal liability. A delay in seeking the medical assistance significantly contributed to Thomas' death and satisfied these elements. Under the causation, while the junior doctor's error complicates the causation analysis, or versus Cheshire established that the medical negligence does not break the chain of causation unless it is so independent and potent that the original act becomes insignificant. Here, the commun's breach remains a substantial and operative cause of Thomas Ted. Therefore, a comic could be held liable for the Thomas death under the gross negligence manslaughter. In other words, the objectively dangerous act under the Orwell's Church, the act must carry an objective risk of harm. In this case, showing the doctor, particularly in an aggressive manner, could reasonably foresee the physical harm, while the doctor's heart condition was unknown to Comey, as per the R versus Watson case in 1989, emphasized the act needs only be objectively dangerous, regardless of hidden vulnerabilities. This differ from R versus Dawson in 1985, where the victim's vulnerability was unforeseeable. Here, a push carries a general risk of harm sufficient to satisfy these elements. The economy's liability for Thomas' death could be analyzed under the doctrine of a constructive manslaughter or the gross negligence manslaughter. So for a constructive manslaughter, the requirement or an unlawful act, the act being objectively dangerous, causation, and resulting death. The unlawful act in this case might arise from Comey supplying Thomas with heroin, which could constitute an offense under the Section 23 of the Offences Act Offences Against the Person Act 1861. However, in Kennedy 2, number 2 in 2007, the court held that if an informed adult voluntarily administers the drugs, the supplier is not liable for harm caused by the self administration. since Thomas voluntarily injected himself. The communist act of supplying the heroin would not satisfy the causation requirement, breaking the chain of causation and precluding the liability for the constructive manslaughter. Under the gross negligence manslaughter, a commie owed a Thomas a duty of care as recognized in Evans 2009, where familial or a close relationship and the facilitation of the drugs use they established a duty. A commie breached this duty by delaying calling for the medical help for over an hour, even though Thomas had lost consciousness. This breach exposed Thomas to an obvious risk of death as heroin overdose carries a well-known danger as per the MISRA 2004. The consultant's statement that the timely treatment would have provided Thomas with an 80% chance of survival highlights the significant role of Cormie's breach in Thomas' death. Although a junior doctor's misdiagnosis initially complicates the causation, the test from Cheshire makes clear that medical negligence does not break the chain unless it is so independent and potent as to render the defendant's actions insignificant. Here, the communist delay in seeking help remains a substantial and operative cause of Thomas' death, making him liable for the GNM, gross negligence manslaughter. So let's look into the liability for the junior's doctor death. A common's liability for the junior's doctor death is best examined under the doctrine of constructive manslaughter. The requirements are an unlawful act, the act being objectively dangerous, causation, and death. A comish push constitute the unlawful act of common assault, satisfying the requirement for a criminally unlawful act as per Franklin in 1883. For the act of objectively dangerous, a reasonable person must foresee a risk of harm. In Church in 1966, the court emphasized that the test is whether an ordinary person would recognize the risk of harm. Here, pushing the doctor, causing him to fall, is likely to seem as objectively dangerous because a fall can forcibly cause a harm. However, the junior doctor's heart conditions complicate this analysis. In Davison, in 1985 case, the court ruled that the defendant was not liable when the victim's heart conditions was unforeseeable. Conversely, in Watson, 1989, liability was upheld when the defendant became aware of the victim's frailty. Since Comey was unaware of doctor's heart condition, it might be argued that this act was not objectively dangerous. Nevertheless, causation is likely satisfied under Cheshire in 1991 as a heart attack caused by the fall remains linked to Comey's action and the unknown heart condition does not sever the chain of causation. To conclude, a commie is not liable for Thomas' death under the constructive manslaughter due to the break in chain of causation following the Thomas voluntary injection of heroin, as per Kennedy. However, Comey's delay in seeking the help constituted the gross negligence, making him liable for the gross negligence manslaughter as per the Adamko and Evans case. For the junior doctor's death, a communist push satisfies the element of constructive manslaughter as it was an unlawful and objectively a dangerous act, and causation is established despite the unknown heart condition as per Church and Cheshire. Therefore, a commie is likely liable for both death under the respective doctrine of manslaughter.